Eric.
Me?
Helms.
Helms. Omar.
Yeah. Can't believe we did it again.
Oops,
We did it again. And I know that Trex, aka T-Rex, aka the Trexler, you're a huge fan of just various pop culture references, and you're not thinking to yourself quietly, please God, don't do this to me again. But we're kind of like Home Alone, Helms, in the sense that we're what, Kevin McAllister, where we were forgotten or we forgot an episode. Something transpired, and now there's a vicious rumor, right? We launched MASScast. We're going to have a lot more of the Mass crew on Iron Culture. It's the perfect intersection of Iron Culture and Mass, so you get a hefty dose of science. But some people have pointed out, those people, Helms, that it seems like there was a mislabeling that occurred with the MASScast, that there is a missing fourth episode. We jumped from 1, 2, 3, then to 5, and then 6. What happened to the fourth episode? There's a vicious rumor going around that something so terrible transpired during that episode, maybe a revealing of, alien life forms outside of here, something that would cause a seismic panic in the general audience, that we never released it. That's unrelated to what's going on today, another MASScast episode. But Helms, can you just explain this to the audience so they could follow along and they could be rest assured that we are the sole inhabitants of this planet, that are, sentient, everything is fine, there are no overlords? Go ahead, man.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to think about physics as we understand them, the probability that there's another civilization that developed with time to actually get here limited by the speed of light, very unlikely. We also should have received some radio signals at this point, if that was the case, in advance of those crafts getting here. So please don't think anything of the fact that there is a missing MASScast. And Mass is really not about that type of science anyway. So obviously we wouldn't have done an episode on that. All those things seem unlikely. And what is unlikely is not impossible, but all I'm saying is don't worry too much about that missing episode.
Right.
We have better things to talk about, like, dietary fat intake.
Yeah, and I don't want you, Trex. I know we kind of pulled this episode together last minute. You're once again a guest host, and I want to be clear on that: a guest host, not a co-host here. That we Eric and myself got on. We're about to do a fire episode. Okay, all about Eric. What were we actually going to talk about at Helms today? What was the topic?
I think it's primarily about the issue of upsetting hierarchies.
Yes.
So, yeah. I don't know about you, Omar, but I was very comfortable with the idea of this shared dictatorship where we rule from atop the pyramid. Next thing I knew, there's some Irish guy up here with us, right?
On an obelisk. What the hell shape is that even?
Not even a pyramid, right? There's other objects in the area. Like, it used to just be us looking down on people who don't even have homes in a very hot beating desert, and getting their adulation and their cheers and cries of support. At least I think that's why they're yelling. I can't hear them from up here. And then all of a sudden we got Connor, because apparently me being an armchair BS historian isn't good enough to do history. And then next thing I know, we're doing these MASScasts, and I got these people who I really only want to see for a couple of days per month when I write my article and just collect the check and bounce. And they're invading my safe space, which is, of course, sitting on top of a pointy object with you holding hands.
Yep.
And now I feel like there's like this, like, it's like a frat party up at the top of this pyramid with an obelisk. So I think we were going to discuss how we were going to reestablish you and I as the duo dictatorship.
Clearly. Yeah.
Right?
It's the duality here. This is a resetting of forms. So we may have to choose a new object, some sort of non-Euclidean geometry.
No, pyramid.
Now, well, Helms, this is what I want to say. I do, in all seriousness, want to give a shout out for Trex agreeing to be on last minute. He apparently had literally nothing else better to do. Where we said, hey, we're missing this episode, right? Episode 4. We got to do it for the people. And Trex said, I would love to. What's the topic? And we said, don't worry about it. So we messaged you about 4 minutes ago of going live. And again, you were just available, which I found astounding. Helms thought it was unlikely, but I said, no, I know that Trexler, he'll be good to go. And here we are, man.
Yeah, I even had my camera makeup on, which is really fortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is worth noting that the reason we started the MASScast was really to kind of keep an eye on what Helms was doing. We got word that he kind of needed some supervision. He was kind of being reckless on the internet. So it's important not to lose that historical fact that we're really just here as like a Helms monitoring program to keep him in line and to prevent some of the nasty emails we were getting, the very legitimate emails that made very good points. So anyway, I'm happy to be here. And I will always be here because, like you said, I really don't have much to do.
Yeah, well, as I understand it, Trex, so I can't remember. You've contributed a lot to a variety of different platforms, but I can't remember the new scope of your upcoming YouTube channel. And I do want to give a quick shout out to that. I believe it's something to do with botany. It's something to do with plants, with home gardening. I see you have a wonderful collection behind you. What is the scope once again? I know you're kind of trying to branch out, pun intended. And that's why you had your, YouTube makeup on ready to go. But what is this thing that you got going on here?
Yeah, I mean, Trex Army, Trex Nation, they've been clamoring for more solo content. And so basically my YouTube channel, Trexler Fitness, at Eric Trexler, about to get it really firing on all cylinders. And, we're going to be talking about, you name it, mostly fitness and health. But if we want to talk about Scandinavian interior design, if we want to talk about plants, if we want to talk about Zen watercolor paintings like the one behind me, we'll talk about it all. We're not shy about that around Trexler Fitness Incorporated.
Go ahead, Helms.
Can I just point out that right now, my background changed. I don't know if those who are watching have seen that. And it looks remarkably like Trex's actual background. And the first time I had a podcast or meeting with Trexler, I can't remember which one, where I saw he had these perfectly placed plants and paintings, white, cream, shades of white. I was like, there's no filter around his head. Like, man, they've gotten really good at creating these seamless backgrounds. He's like, no, this is legitimately where I live. I have these plants. I have this meditation bowl. And I'm like, wow, like that's perfect. And so right now, I'm just standing in solidarity with finding a similar background to you. So I got you.
When my wife and I moved into this house, I used to tell her with a very monotone voice and a straight face, interior design is my passion. And I was only part kidding. I actually kind of do like picking out paintings. They're nice. The cheap ones, I'm going on Wayfair and getting the prints. These aren't, originals, unfortunately.
Not yet. Let me just say, we're thrilled to have you back on. To be clear, everyone, do not get excited. Don't be clamoring where you see Trexler. He's not joining as a co-host. He is strictly a guest host here. The topic is dietary fats. I do want to read very briefly, though, because Helms, we've had a few episodes, a ton of different guests, but there have been some comments. There's one I want to highlight, though, from a longtime reader. Actually, it's from the episode with Lauren Conlon, just before we begin, Trex. And it's by Shruti is the name. She said, I'm what you would call Omar's favorite type of athlete, a distance runner. But here we go. This is basically a review of Iron Culture right here. I started lifting 2 years ago to mitigate injury and improve my run training. And soon enough, I found Iron Culture. I've been listening to you guys for 2 years. Without a doubt, in my mind, you've played a huge role in keeping me consistent, interested, and experimental in lifting. Thank you. So shout out to you, Shruti. I do, because people will leave comments. It got 7 likes, Helms. And I feel bad when they take the time to write these paragraphs and they mean it, and then we don't acknowledge it. We're atop the pyramid with a pointy object.
Hey, sometimes someone can have their voice heard above the mewling masses, and we can elevate them to the top of the pyramid. And sometimes we don't even do a ritual sacrifice. So thank you, Shruti. I appreciate that.
So weird that Trexler has his, he said meditation bowl. Like there's rituals y'all are about to understand that you won't even be able to comprehend on this plane, but that's for another story. The MASScast 4 is here. Trexler, as I understand it, you may or may not have
MASScast 4?
Well, we've missed.
That one never happened.
Oh, no, right. So it never happened. Brandon, delete that, alter it, voice modulate myself.
This is 7. Number 6 or 7, depending 6 or 7,
yeah. It's kind of cool.
How you want to count.
It's fluctuating, right? It remains to be seen. We're definitely not talking about dietary fats because, myself and Helms got our body fats measured. In an upcoming episode, we'll discuss that and the latest research in Grant Tinsley. And one of us, I'm not going to say which one, I will just ask this question simply, Helms, and then let Trexler take over. On the pod, who had the lower body fat percentage between myself and you? Keep in mind, Eric is shredded. Eric, like, if Eric was to stand up and lift up his shirt, he like legitimately has an 8-pack. But when they measured the bod pod, my friend, who had the lower body fat?
I think that might have been you, my friend.
And are we joking now for once on Iron Culture? Are we being serious?
No, like 100%. We did 9 different body fat assessments.
This is true, Trex.
And
like, that's serious.
You were leaner on one of them.
Yeah.
And it was the bod pod.
Which is the gold standard, as we know. There's no controversy there.
As we know.
So someone's here to learn, and people would assume, obviously, it's me. I'm the only one 3 here without a PhD in this discipline. But we're here today to talk about dietary fats. Unrelated to that astounding announcement of who was lower on a bod pod. So please, Trexler, take it away.
Yeah, I just want to mention one time I was reviewing a paper as a peer reviewer for a journal, and someone did try to slip a line in there that said, bod pod, the gold standard of body composition assessment. I said, whoa, wait a minute. But my mistake, Omar. I should have known. So let's talk about dietary fat, because here's the thing. If you talk to an esteemed fitness professional and you say, for me to achieve my fitness goals, what is like the bare minimum protein target that I should shoot for? Most folks in the fitness world will give you an answer, and they will give you a justification for that answer, right? They'll say you need this much, and it's usually, 1.6, 1.8, whatever they want to go with, grams per kilogram, and they'll talk about protein synthesis, and they'll talk about all this stuff, meta-analyses, etc. If you ask someone, how much carbohydrate should I be eating, bare minimum, to support my goals, you might not get as many answers that are like really direct. You might not get the same level of agreement, but people will broadly say, well, you do some high intensity stuff. You should have about this much. Make sure you get some around your workouts. There's still like a semi consensus there. If you ask someone, what is the bare minimum fat that I need for a physiological reason? A lot of folks come up blank. But, there's just not really a consensus there. A lot of folks struggle to answer that. And usually the answer you get is, well, here's what people typically do eat, right? It's not like a physiological reason why you need at least this much per day. So in a recent Mass article, after kind of dancing around this question for a long time, I said, enough is enough. I want to actually dig into, what are the absolute bare minimums that we need for dietary fat? And very quickly, I realized that the first thing I needed to do was kind of effectively frame that question, because you kind of have to ask yourself, bare minimum for what? Are you talking about the bare minimum fat that you need to survive? And we're talking about dietary fat here, not body fat. So that's one question, to survive, to avoid short-term serious adverse medical events, to support hormone levels, to feel good, to have an enjoyable diet. You're going to find a slightly different threshold for all these different things. Fat-soluble vitamin absorption, right? There's a lot of different factors, and depending on what you consider a need versus a luxury, that's going to kind of depend where your minimum fat target is. So if you don't mind, I'd like to go through some of these if that's agreeable to you. So the first, I wanted to find bare minimum. Let's say that I want to go on a low-fat diet for whatever reason, and I'm really extreme about it. If if I'm going to do this for 3 months, what is the bare minimum that I need so that I don't have a serious medical event within the next 3 months? So we're talking semi-short term, but not a week, right? And so from looking at the literature, the best outcome I could find that seems to really have a limiting effect, that really sets a constraint there, it seems to be gallstone prevention, right? So gallstones don't really talk about it much in the fitness world. They don't come up very much, but gallstones are these little hard, pebble-like objects, kind of like stones that form within your gallbladder. And the gallbladder is this tiny little organ. in your abdomen, upper right quadrant, and it basically is storing bile. So the liver produces bile, it goes to the gallbladder where it gets stored. And it's interesting because these gallstones tend to form during like really rapid, precipitous amounts of fat loss on these like really, really extreme restrictive diets. And it seems like there's kind of two things driving that independently. One is just a massive, lack of caloric intake and this rapid fat loss. Studies where we're bringing people down from a BMI of 40 way down really, really quickly. And we also see it specifically when they're on these really extreme low fat diets. All right. And so the thought process is that when you combine really low caloric intake, or I should say, or extremely low fat intake, there's just kind of a lack of motility. That bile isn't really getting released to the same extent. It's just kind of sitting there in the gallbladder, and it creates conditions that are very suitable for gallstone formation. And so I was able to look into the literature, and, fortunately, people have looked into this. And when we're talking about these diets, I mean, these are really restrictive. I do think one of the things that I say many times, and I'll say it again, in the fitness industry, when we talk about like, what's the lowest calorie target a diet could possibly have, a lot of folks are like, dude, if you're going under 1,400 calories a day, you're basically dead. But if you go into the medical literature, and this isn't a recommendation, you go into the medical literature, you will find people who are on 500 calorie diets for many weeks on end. And so I was looking at a study where people were on these like 500 to 800 calorie diets. And really the question was, how much fat do we need to put into these super low calorie diets during these weight loss interventions to really effectively attenuate gallstone formation? So we can't say it's impossible that you're going to have a gallstone or develop gallstones, but how much do we need to really attenuate that considerably? And the answer is shockingly low. So just like, a lot of people are stunned to hear that there are many studies with these like 500-600 calorie diets for 3 months in a row, people will be stunned to hear that this seems to be kind of the short-term limiting constraint on low-fat diets. And you can probably attenuate that gallstone formation pretty effectively with like 7 to 12 grams per day of fat, which to me was stunning because, I've talked to people about, hey, how low can you really go with fat? I've never heard someone say, as long as you have 7 grams a day, like you're set. Why would you need more than 7, right? And actually, Helms, I remember back in the day, we were working on a paper together, and you were saying, oh yeah, it was for, contest prep reasons. And you said, yeah, sometimes I'll let people go down to 0.5 grams of fat per kilogram of body mass. And I said, Helms, that's insane. That's reckless. You can't do that to a human being. It's 0.7. And I forget exactly where we settled on that. I think we went with 0.5 in the paper, and I just, talked. I said a lot of things about Helms behind his back with the co-authors.
I think we even compromised more than that. I think you were like 0.3, but you were, or rather it was like 0.3. I remember there's a gram per pound versus a gram per kilogram discussion. And, but yeah, you settled on slightly higher. But can I make a brief cultural observation on kind of what you're getting at here is the how this is framed. So one of the things I noticed when the low carb community makes a push, they framed, hey, we're a lot more resilient and a lot more metabolically flexible than we think. Like ketosis is not a bad thing. Ketoacidosis is not the same thing as just, dietary induced ketosis, right? However, when you start talking about low fat intakes, all of a sudden the fragility narrative totally swaps that out. Like, oh my God, hormones are going to tank, and let me throw something in about myelin sheaths and fat-soluble vitamins and sleep quality, digestion, all this stuff. And then, it's a really interesting kind of narrative. And it's ignoring the fact that we have decades and decades of standard practice when it was much more commonly accepted that, reducing fat is a proxy for reducing saturated fat, and it's a proxy for reducing calories, and that's how you deal with, heart disease and obesity. But there's some pretty wild stuff that's happened, and I think whenever someone is framing either as a fragility thing, they're probably not fully aware of just how resilient humans are. Like there's a classic case of, I think it's still the longest fast on record, of Angus Barbary, who was, he went on a fast from 1965 in June to 1966 in July and lived on tea, coffee, soda water, and vitamins. He lived in Scotland and dropped 125 kilograms for that period. And I think he still has the record for a length of a fast. So like, that's not eating anything, fat or carbs. And it's just kind of wild when you look at like, what can we do versus what should we do? And they're very different questions. And then the different contexts and where it can harm us. So anyway, I would just encourage people to be aware of the changing goalposts depending upon the favorite macronutrient, whoever you're talking to, and that maybe we're not quite as fragile as we think, especially in the short term. So anyway, take it away.
No, that's a great addition. And I like the little caveat there, especially in the short term, because I don't want listeners to get the impression that that stuff just doesn't matter, right? Fat-soluble vitamins, you'd like to absorb them if you can. Essential fatty acids, we need them. And that's actually the one I want to focus on next, is essential fatty acids. So who remembers their old biochemistry class? You know, those lovely diagrams, the structures of all the different fatty acid chains. So structure and function go hand in hand when it comes to fatty acids. And we can define these different fatty acids based on their chemical structure. And the thing that differentiates an unsaturated fat from a saturated fat is the presence of double bonds in this long hydrocarbon chain. And the way that we name a lot of different fats, a major factor there is, where are the double bonds? And so when we talk about omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids, those are things we hear about because when we're in a vitamin shop, we see them, sitting in a little container over there. So those are referring to where the first double bond is relative to the omega end of this fatty acid chain. And the reason that you've heard of omega-3s and omega-6s and not much else is because humans don't have the enzymes required to actually synthesize omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. We're generally pretty good at taking all the raw materials and rearranging fatty acids to make what we need based on, the physiological conditions. But with omega-3 and omega-6, we can't just synthesize those out of thin air. We just don't have the enzymatic machinery required. And that's why we need to get them from our diet. So if we go 7 grams a day and it's, a fat, just a normal fat, it's not like a super highly targeted omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid supplement that's making up all 7 of those grams, eventually over time, we probably will not be in our best possible kind of optimal state in terms of our health and wellness because we're not getting enough of these essential fatty acids. So then the question is, if we're talking about setting these kind of lower boundaries, well, how much is enough? And there's not necessarily consensus agreement. And what's really interesting is there's really not enough evidence with essential fatty acids to say scientifically, here is the absolute bare minimum that you need. Like, we just don't really have the data for long enough time periods to say this is the exact amount that you need on a daily basis. So what they do is they look at adequate intake levels. So they basically look at healthy folks and say, what are you guys eating? Right? So they look for the median intake among healthy individuals. And so for linoleic acid, which is the primary omega-6 fatty acid source in the diet, the adequate intake level, that median in healthy folks, is about 17 grams a day for males and about 12 grams a day for females. Now, I've seen some papers argue that you should be able to get away with as low as 3 to 6 grams a day of linoleic acid. Like I said, it's an omega-6 fatty acid. So even if we're really conservative there, 3 to 6 grams a day of that. For alpha-linolenic acid, which is kind of the primary dietary source of omega-3, of course, you can do EPA and DHA from your fish oil. Those are also omega-3s. Those are just kind of down the chain from alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, as you've likely heard of it. Basically, the human body can convert ALA into EPA and DHA down the line. You'll see all sorts of arguments about exactly how efficient that conversion is, but we can do it. It can be done. But anyway, so when we look at ALA, this omega-3 fatty acid source, usually adequate intake levels, we're talking about between 1 and 1.5 grams per day. 1.1 if you're female, 1.6 if you're male. So even if we're going like absolute bare minimum there, you might be thinking, okay, well, let's say we try to get, 1 or 2 grams of omega-3. Let's say we try to get, 6 grams of omega-6. We also have to factor in that in most typical diets, we're not just getting pure omega-3 and pure omega-6. I mean, hell, even in your fish oil supplement, right? You'll look at the fish oil supplement and it'll say, yeah, there's 2 grams of fat if you take both of these capsules, but you're only getting, I don't know what the percentage is. It kind of depends on what form of fish oil you're going with. There's the various different types with various concentration levels, but usually only a fraction of that fat intake, even for a concentrated fish oil supplement, is actually omega-3 fatty acid. And then, of course, when you start getting into the various oil and fat sources that are, conventional foods that are not designed to be concentrated sources, we see that percentage, often tends to get even lower in terms of per gram of fat, how much omega-3 or omega-6 am I really getting? So with that in mind, without getting too bogged down in all the different calculations and assumptions, you basically have to say, how much of these do I really need? And then what realistic percentage could I hope to find in a conventional diet? Maybe add a little bit of supplementation in. I would say if you're looking to try to get, enough essential fatty acids, you're probably looking at a daily fat intake bare minimum of 20 or 30 grams a day. Now, like I said, for short stretches, of course, you can get away with lower. We've seen it many times in the literature. All it takes is, 7 to 10, maybe 12 to make sure you're not getting those immediate, issues like gallstone formation. But in the long term, I really wouldn't feel great about going too far below 20, 30 grams a day. And just to put some numbers on that, like if you look at safflower oil, that would be for omega-6, we're talking about like 70% linoleic acid by weight. Something like peanut oil would only be like 20% by weight. So that's kind of setting these for most typical oil sources, the upper and lower boundaries. So you can kind of see that if we're needing, let's say we want to be conservative and say, let's at least get between the two of these combined, 10 grams a day of essential fatty acids between our omega-6s, omega-3s, we're probably going to have to go bare minimum in that 20 to 30 gram range, I would say. And that's actually a really convenient number because are there any questions or comments about essential fatty acids?
Yeah, so it sounds like we've basically got kind of 2 thresholds. There's the I don't want gallstones. And just for those who are not aware, gallbladder produces bile. Bile helps us digest fat. Kind of makes sense that we're on a very, very low fat diet, given all the feedback mechanisms in our body. We might not be producing as much bile, therefore we develop gallstones. Those hurt. That's a problem, potential medical issue. I'm assuming, Eric, there isn't any clear timeline on, okay, I'm consuming 0 fat or 5 grams of fat or just trace fats. What is the risk or timeline of developing gallstones? Do you have any take on that? And understandably, if you don't.
Based on what I've seen, I would think weeks, not days. But if we can see meaningful differences in prevalence in these studies that only last, 3 months, that kind of gives you an idea that it's not a good idea for more than, a couple days at a time at most, I would say. But yeah, I haven't seen a paper that kind of gives a down to the day granular timeline of that formation. But in, 12 weeks is not a long time. And to see meaningful separation and prevalence in different groups, I would say that kind of tells you that the timeline for an individual who's hoping to avoid it is considerably less than 12 weeks, I would think.
No, that's perfect. And it actually kind of leads to something one of my colleagues at 3D Muscle Journey, Brad Loomis, some of the ways he likes to cut is he'll do a version of the 5-2 diet, which is just where you have a couple days a week where you're in a large deficit. And he just almost goes like almost zero fat on those days, just trace fats. And he finds that doesn't really impede. He's still able to eat his fruits and vegetables and high protein diet, which he feels is the most satiating. Not everyone experiences that, by the way. And there is data on very high fat diets, typically ketogenic, which may not be the high fat component, could be the low carb component, enhancing satiety. So little asterisks there. But anyway, he likes to really go like low fat on 2 days. And if your habitual fat intake is like 80, 90 grams, and you drop that by 70 grams, you're going to be in a substantial deficit, like a 600 calorie deficit if that's maintenance. You do that twice a week and you're dropping, half a pound, a third of a pound without really trying. So it's an interesting thing that you brought that up as an application, because I wanted this tag on. Like, there's a potential application there if you're doing some of these nonlinear dieting strategies where it's 1 day out of 7 where you're probably not risking anything. And obviously, moving up, that it sounds like you're creating this stepwise thing of listen, on the order of weeks, maybe days, immediate health issues if you're consuming zero fat. And that's why we have essential fatty acids, which is then the next step up. Okay, if we want to prevent long-term issues of not having sufficient vitamin absorption and the other functions of those omega chain positions that we can't fulfill endogenously, then we've got to be consuming those omega-3s, omega-6s. And to do that with a reasonable diet, we're talking 20, 30 grams. So it's good. We're kind of stacking things up. And there are different applications, I would say, just coaching between those two different things. Like, potentially you could feel comfortable going trace fats on a day or two if you were to take that approach. But if you wanted to have a more linear approach to your diet, well, you're going to build some more on top of this. But it sounds like, at least at this stage, as you're building out your rationale, you could have stints where you approached things with a pretty low fat intake in the 20 to 30 gram range.
Sure. Yeah. And now that I kind of see where you were going with that question about the timeline, I mean, we could even just look at the various short-term fasting studies and say like, okay, well, if we have someone fast for a couple days, right, we don't see, oh, that's an automatic gallstone issue, right? I mean, if we are talking about weeks rather than days with gallstones, but we're not talking about like several months, right? And so, I wouldn't really have any qualms about taking that type of approach where you're, kind of robbing. You're going super low fat one day, but you're making up for it on other days where you're going presumably comfortably above 7 grams a day, right? Like, so yeah, you're still kind of averaging out, at a reasonable level there, even with those days of trace fat in the middle there.
So the goal is to have the same intake of creatine as you have of fat in the day, basically. Yeah.
Trex,
that's one way to do it.
Were you about to say robbing Peter to pay Paul? What was your one reference about to be a biblical reference?
I was gonna go there, and I wasn't sure if I was using it entirely properly, so I bailed. I pulled the ripcord.
Folks, that may have been the first almost Trexler. I wouldn't quite call it pop culture reference, but it was almost there, man.
But yeah, I'm a couple thousand years behind on pop culture, but I'm getting there. I'm on a serious note, I'm at Duke University now, doing research, and I do research with the Clergy Health Initiative, and so I'm working with folks in the Department of Sociology and in the Divinity School. So I'm going to be getting all sorts of biblical references coming your way. Believe me. It's awesome.
I just want to say, completely unrelated, Helms, the fact that we had that not episode 4, where we may or may not have encountered a higher species, and now we're having someone on, Trexler, that has a close association with some people in a divinity school. It's unrelated whatsoever. We're not saying it's end of days, folks. Revelations was correct. None of those things. They're unrelated. Just happenstance. Serendipity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But anyway,
as you were saying,
Helms. One of the things you mentioned was fat-soluble vitamin absorption. And in writing this article, so like my intro here, I mentioned, hey, how come no one has like a good definitive answer when you say, how much fat do I really need physiologically? The answer is because the research isn't really like all that fleshed out, which really surprised me. You would think that this is kind of like foundational, like, as we're writing the manual for how to operate the human body, you feel like you want to hammer this stuff out kind of early in that process. And we still just don't have a lot of great data for some of this stuff. Like, so for example, essential fatty acids, we're kind of just looking at like, okay, what do healthy people do? Right? And like, we're kind of piecing it together. We know we need them, but if you try to piece together, like, how long does it take to actually develop clinical symptoms from insufficient fatty acid uptake? It gets kind of, it's kind of hard to say. So we just go for median intakes and go back from there. So essential fatty acids, you kind of have to fill in some gaps there and make some assumptions. The same thing is true when it comes to how much fat we need to really facilitate fat-soluble vitamin absorption. And so, like, we can look at, for example, folks who have medical conditions that involve malabsorption of fat. So, conditions that cause them to really struggle to absorb fat in their intestinal tract. We can see that fat-soluble vitamin insufficiencies and deficiencies develop over time in those folks. So we have that kind of proof of principle. Okay, being able to absorb fat is important for, and biochemically it makes sense why we would need some fat intake to facilitate that absorption. But when you look into the actual like individual studies that truly investigate how much fat do we need in a meal with a, fat-soluble vitamin supplement, or, how close does fat intake need to be in relation to the consumption of some of these fat-soluble vitamins, it's kind of all over the place. I mean, I've seen, like, for example, I've looked into the vitamin D research, and you can find some papers that say, hey, if you have kind of a middle amount of fat, that's great for absorption, but too low and too high in some studies seems to be not so ideal for vitamin D absorption in the short term. In the long term, as long as you're eating fat, it seems to come out in the wash for vitamin D. I've seen some studies for, individual vitamins like vitamin A or vitamin E where, for one, you find a paper, like for vitamin E, I found a paper that was, kind of went along with exactly what you would think. Eat more fat, absorb more from the meal, all good to go. But I did find some research. I think I found a paper for vitamin A where it just didn't seem to matter much at all. They gave all these different levels of fat intake, including, completely no fat. And they're like, yeah, people were absorbing the vitamin just fine in this context. And so then you start getting into questions about, okay, but, residual fat that's kind of working its way through the GI tract from meals way long ago, or maybe even, many, many hours after the vitamin is consumed, some of this stuff kind of slows down and takes time. So perhaps even if you're totally fasted and you have some fat-soluble vitamins come in, perhaps your meal way later in the day, if there's some fat, can still help out a little bit. So all of that is to say, if you want to go find a paper that just gives you a nice little linear trajectory and say, oh, okay, now I see how much fat I need to absorb fat-soluble vitamins. I didn't find it. I don't think you will either. But if you do, send it to me. But anyway, all that is to say, we know that if you just go zero fat and do that in perpetuity, you're going to have issues with fat-soluble vitamins. But it is difficult to give a really precise number about how much fat you need per day. I have seen enough in the literature to suggest, even before writing this article, just a few weeks ago, I felt that, if I was taking a multivitamin, I should have had a meal with a decent amount of fat, at least within like an hour or two before that. I don't feel as strongly about that anymore. I think as long as I'm having some fat at some point throughout that day, and I'm not going out of my way to separate those two things, after looking more at this research, I just don't think it matters all that much. It's not a bad idea to have some, if you're going to take your multivitamin, to take it with a meal that has some fat in it. But after looking at the actual original data, I think I was way overestimating the impact of that kind of precise timing of fat intake.
That's something, just real quick, that I notice is kind of a persistent disconnect in nutrition, is we don't have a lot of really good data that draws the link between digestion time courses and nutrient absorption, and then the impact of those nutrients. Like, first thing that comes to my mind is all the MPS data, right? We know kind of how that operates when you're in a fasted state, consuming whey and nothing else. But then once we start to look at the time course and the slowing of gastric emptying when we're consuming mixed meals, higher calories, fiber, fat, different sources of protein, we're like, oh, maybe that's why these things don't actually play out the way they do in the lab in the real world. And the kind of the same thing like you used to get in your nutrition 101 classes, like, okay, if you're a vegan or vegetarian, well, we need essential amino acids and we need the full complement of them. So you have to eat these complementary protein sources. So, you have to eat beans and rice together. And you can't have beans at breakfast and rice for dinner and separate them because, then you're going multiple hours in a day without the full complement of amino acids. And I think we know by now that's pretty much not the way it operates. And that seems like a kind of a similar, understanding here that you're getting of essential fatty acids in addition to essential amino acids.
Yeah, and I mean, to give myself a lot of credit, which I like to do, I was in a nutrition class, and my nutrition professor, it really stuck with me. She's like, "Oh, and yeah, when you have this nice, colorful, beautiful salad that you're eating, drizzle some olive oil on there so that you'll actually absorb the vitamins from all the red stuff and the purple stuff and the yellow stuff and the orange stuff, which is, the kind of colors that kind of give you that hint. Yeah, there's probably some fat-soluble vitamins in there." So I guess the moral of the story is don't trust teachers or science. This is bad stuff. Get away from it. But anyway, yeah, so now that I've kind of looked into the original data, I'm like, oh, yeah, maybe you can just have your olive oil for dinner and have that nice lunch for salad. And maybe it's not so critical to time those up perfectly. But, if you try to look at papers that at least put forth a number and say, hey, we have the goal to try to put a number on how much fat you should eat every day to facilitate, reasonably adequate uptake of these fat-soluble vitamins. Like I said, paper to paper, you'll find, it's kind of messy, but I do think it's fair to say that you at least want to get up into a particular range, like, super, super low fat across the board in aggregate, across all the fat-soluble vitamins, doesn't seem to be ideal for uptake. And so the question is, how high do we have to get to feel like we're either optimizing or at least getting within the ballpark of optimization where we can feel like, hey, if the goal was to absorb all these fat-soluble vitamins, I'm giving my body what it really needs here. The best estimate that I've been able to kind of find in the literature is 10% of your energy intake coming from fat. Now, the problem with that is I get it. I understand why it was presented that way, but I don't think it really makes sense to present that as a percentage because I don't think, now that you're bulking, you don't need that relationship between fat intake and vitamin absorption, changes. And the same thing, just because you're going on a super, super low calorie diet, I mean, you would still need the same amount of fat, I would assume, in order to really absorb those vitamins effectively. I mean, there could be some small amount of variation, but, we're not dramatically changing that relationship when we change our calorie intake. And so the way I try to simplify this in my brain, in a way that I can digest, no pun intended, is, 10% of total energy. They're basically assuming when they give these papers, these recommendations in papers for the general population, you're probably eating a pretty typical calorie intake, something in the ballpark of 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day. Those are kind of those standard food label numbers that we're used to seeing, on all the government recommendations, things like that. So what we can do is say that probably ends up being about 22 to 28 grams per day of fat. And no one's going to remember 22 to 28. And it's not that precise an estimate anyway. So for my money's worth, I say round that out to 20 to 30. And the really convenient thing there is that it's exactly where we ended up with the essential fatty acids. So like Helms was saying, we kind of have this hierarchical structure. I can't really think of a good way to frame that. Some kind of high. Oh, that's an interesting idea. But anyway, we've got, the absolute bare minimum so that you will not have, a high risk of gallstone formation in the next 3 months, right? For that, we're only talking about 7 to 12 grams a day, roughly. if we're talking about, okay, but I want this to actually be like a sustainable diet that I'm going to be doing for months on end, then we're starting to see, okay, well, you definitely want to have essential fatty acids coming in. You want to be able to absorb your fat-soluble vitamins. For that type of application, you probably don't want to be too far below 20 to 30 grams a day. And I think for most folks of most body sizes, that should be a pretty appropriate number in grams, because I don't expect that this would fluctuate too much with variations in body size. I think this is more of a
like an absolute lower threshold.
yeah, I don't think it should scale too aggressively with body size, if I had to guess. And so that is where, in my mind, I draw another line, right? So the first line is like avoiding acute medical issues. And then the second line is like, okay, but we need to like get our bare minimums for like being a healthy person long-term sustainably. And now we pass that line and we get into something that is, I don't want to call it a luxury, but it's like, it's negotiable, right? So like Helms, for example, you're familiar with bodybuilding, right? Natural bodybuilding.
A little bit.
When you signed up for prep and you said, I'm going to do a competition, were you generally comfortable with the idea that a reduction in testosterone was part of what you signed up for?
Yes.
And that's good, because whether you know it or not, that is what you sign up for. So some people will say, hey, I didn't sign up for that. Yeah, you did. You just didn't know you did. You did.
You're getting the informed consent right now live on the air, folks.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like one of those like agreements for a software. It's like, by using this, you've already accepted that this is the term and condition. So yeah, like we know that fat seems to play a role in supporting sex hormone production. And I don't want to call it a luxury, because like I think it's fair to say like, hey, you deserve to have the hormones that your body's making if you choose to. So it's definitely ideal to support sex hormone production and to keep that within a reasonably optimal range. But at the same time, I can understand why some people would be willing to say, I'll take the hit, right? I'm okay either for competitive reasons, for some particular dieting endeavor. I'm good with kind of not having truly optimal sex hormone levels for the next 3 months, 6 months, whatever. So now we kind of reach this other level of like, it's still probably a good idea to get a higher level of fat than we've talked about so far if we want to optimize or at least reasonably support sex hormone production. But it is technically kind of negotiable rather than an absolute necessity. And the reason I draw this line is because if I was coaching someone, would I feel comfortable for short periods of time, and perhaps even, short could be months, telling someone, yeah, we're going down to 35 or 30 grams of fat per day? It's not where I'd start them, ideally, but I could live with that. I could be okay with that. But I would never be going below that range I mentioned. Like, unless it was, like an application Helms said for like a day, a couple days. For me, going below that 20 to 30 threshold is pretty non-negotiable. As a coach, I wouldn't do it for a sustained period of time. But, going below the level needed to optimally support sex hormone production, I actually can get on board with that if the person knows that that's what's going on. So hopefully, if you're working with a coach and you're doing a prep, they gave you a heads up. I think that's kind of an ethical requirement in my mind. But the question is, though, how much fat do we really need in order to support sex hormone production? And this is something I've written about a few times in Mass, and I'll keep this one pretty brief and superficial, because this is one of the few areas where I can say, oh, okay, we actually have like a decent idea. So, essential fatty acids, fat-soluble vitamins, it's hazy. Like, we can get in a range, but it's kind of messy. When it comes to supporting sex hormones, we actually have two pretty good meta-analyses we can go with. One in looking at testosterone levels in males, the other looking at estrogen levels in females. And by the grace of God, they are pretty compatible. Like they align on a pretty overlapping range in terms of the estimate. So this is one of those where we don't really have to go too far out on a limb and can feel reasonably comfortable. So basically, there was a meta-analysis by Whitaker in 2021, and they were looking at the effect of mostly short-term low-fat diets on testosterone levels. And what they found was, to kind of really summarize it superficial, you probably don't want to go too far below like 20-25% of your energy coming from fat in these diets. And these were, it's important to note, fairly weight stable diets. Like they weren't trying to do like really aggressive weight loss or weight gain diets. So that gives us a general idea of where caloric intake generally was. We're talking about people who are just trying to stay weight neutral. And it was about 20-25% of calories. You probably don't want to go too far below that. That's where we start to really see testosterone dropping off. The meta-analysis in women, actually, this is one of those areas where the female data actually came before the male data. And I suspect that a lot of interest in this was because of, if I had to guess, keen medical interest in the relationship between estrogen and the progression of estrogen-sensitive breast cancer cells. So some forms of breast cancer are very sensitive to estrogen levels. And so given the public health impact of breast cancer, I think this is one of those areas where they were actually digging into the female research and female medical applications, and the male stuff kind of came later. A lot of times in exercise science, we see the inversion, right? Where we do a million studies in males, then say, oh, should we check to see if this applies to females as well? So this was one of those interesting areas where it's inverted. So the meta-analysis on estrogen was from 1999. It was like a good 20-year head start in this literature in terms of having enough to really pull it together. And what they found was basically if you're going from a higher fat diet to lower fat, again, we see these reductions in estrogen. The higher fat diets were around 29-46% total energy, and the lower fats were like 12-25%. And so for them, they were looking more at, they basically indicated that there's a pretty steep drop off when you get below like 20% of energy from fat. So for both these meta-analyses, we're looking at this like 20-25% cutoff range. And that's really nice. I think we have pretty good evidence to say that that's where we probably set it. And then again, if we kind of make some basic assumptions about, how much energy intake is really being consumed on a daily basis, I feel pretty comfortable rounding that out. It would end up being about 45 to 55 grams per day. I think giving that a little bit more room, I think, for practical application, I think anywhere from 40 to 60 grams per day of fat for most folks is going to put them in that spot where they may not be necessarily fully optimizing their testosterone, but they're avoiding that fairly precipitous drop-off in testosterone where we start to see that extreme fat restriction starts to really make an impact. So basically, that's where we get the physiological stuff. And then one thing I do want to mention as just a very brief aside is that's great if we're doing, textbook science, but we also have to keep in mind personal preference and feasibility. And so like Helms, when your colleague at 3DMJ is doing his day of trace fat intake, not a lot of options for food sources, right? Like it's good. You mentioned he likes fruits and vegetables. Many of them tend to be very, very low fat. You find a super low fat protein source, you're good to go. It's not like you have no options, but a lot of times if you tell someone like, hey, we're going to give you a 20% fat diet, and they ask you, oh, cool, what should my fat sources be? My first answer is usually kind of don't worry about it. Like by the time you get your protein in and your carbs in, you might find that you're already pretty close to 20% without having a classical fat source in your diet, right? Oatmeal has fat in it. What you'll find is like even, white meat, skinless chicken breast has some fat in it, And so a lot of folks, they'll get to 20% before they actually see any fat in their diet. And so that's the final thing to keep in mind here is when you're considering some of these low fat approaches, if you're coaching someone or if you're building your own diet, you have to really seriously think about food preferences and say, okay, science aside, we've got the theory part reasonably fleshed out here, but is there a practical way for me to actually, like, does this even matter for me? Or will I hate any diet that puts me below 40 grams of fat a day? And a lot of people, the answer is yes, right? Like a lot of people do not enjoy being on a diet that has less than 40 grams of fat per day. So summary numbers, we've talked a lot here. So I want to hit the highlights. If all you're trying to do is attenuate like short-term issues over, specifically gallstone formation over the span of, a month or 2 or 3, 7 to 12 grams of fat per day, shockingly enough, seems to be able to do that. If you want to support essential fatty acid intake and fat-soluble vitamin absorption for a longer-term, more sustained diet, at least 20 to 30 grams per day of fat is probably the absolute lowest I would go. And then if you say, yeah, but I would like to support my sex hormone levels, I'm not like Helms, I'm not willing to take that drop in testosterone on the chin, or at least I want to fight it, then I'd say 40 to 60 grams per day is probably where you want to find your minimum. So yeah, it was a deep dive into the literature. I was hoping to find more conclusive answers, but it just doesn't really seem like they're out there yet. But I think for all intents and purposes, these basic ranges and heuristics should work reasonably well.
Trex, you crushed it. And I think the only thing left to talk about, which I'll jump into now to really complement what you were saying, is the instances of where you might even be doing this, why, and to really actually leverage that biblical quote of robbing Peter to pay Paul. The whole signing up for it in the bodybuilding context or any extreme or fat loss scenario. What I mean by an extreme fat loss scenario is either you need to get really lean or you're trying to drop a lot of body fat in a short-term period. This is where this becomes relevant and forces you into these scenarios. Any other scenario, if you're doing it right, and by quote unquote right, I mean you're giving yourself enough time to diet, you're dieting down to a reasonable body fat, it's something that you can sustain, and this is a lifestyle change, you shouldn't have to make this concession. And it is an unnecessarily aggressive approach where you are going, oh, well, I'm going to take a hit of my testosterone. Well, why? That's not going to help this process. It's going to hinder it, right? So why would you? So the times when we do need to consider it are when you have to get really, really lean. And as we've discussed, and as you've discussed actually on this podcast, the adaptations that we experience when dieting means that our calories typically need to get disproportionately lower. Omar teased the upcoming episode that we're going to have with Dr. Tinsley, but we measured my resting metabolic rate, and it was lower than, I want to say, like 13 different equations, all the different equations.
Okay.
So there was a reduction, but there probably is a reduction in my non-exercise or resting energy expenditure, my NEAT, as it's colloquially called. And that's on top of the fact that my RMR was somewhere between 5 to 20% less than it would be predicted based upon various equations. So that means if I want to go from being really lean right now to where I have glute striations from the side and if you squint just right from the back, and there's a reason why I'm 5.5 weeks out at that leanness, is because I need to get even leaner if that's what I want to be competitive at. And I often frame this for people like, hey, it's not healthy for your shoulder joint to do what you need to do to throw a 90 to 100 mile per hour fastball. And that's why you see a lot of surgeries in pitchers, and bodybuilding's no different. And this is one of those areas where you need that informed consent. But if I only wanted to diet down to, let's just say 85 kilos instead of 80 kilos and just go, right, I'm going to be at the low end of my lower intervention point and just compete in powerlifting and live a little fatter and a little happier, but still pretty lean, it would be a non-issue. I wouldn't have the same adaptive reduction in metabolic rate. I wouldn't need to diet even further. I wouldn't be dropping below my lower intervention point, and I wouldn't be soliciting my body to push back against me to create the scenario. And you might go, well, Eric, why don't you get the deficits from somewhere else? Why don't you just walk more, right? Because I could say, well, I could keep my fat higher and then drop my carbohydrate, but then I run into other issues, right? So now there's potentially performance issues. Now there's glycogen depletion, which to a certain degree could actually impede my contractility or my ability to perform volumes, et cetera. We've got data on the performance side of things. And the biggest tool I have to fight muscle loss is not having a small mean difference higher in testosterone. It's being able to perform well. And so I think there's a few things to keep in context. One, even if I was to say up my step count to 20,000 steps per day so I could have both a high carb and a high fat intake, that activity would still deplete some of those carbs, right? It would still use some of that fat for energy. And in addition, if I create the same energy imbalance, I'm still going to create a status of low energy availability, which is almost an inevitable consequence for the vast majority of competitors unless they have a very, very low body fat percentage. As we talked about in the whole Can You Stay Shredded episode that you and I did, Omar, it is also a article that you can find on Stronger by Science, which I authored. It was one of our lead articles of one of our mass issues not too long ago. And Omar, you also did a great YouTube video on it summarizing it. There's an interaction between these two things, the amount of energy you need to take relative to your energy output, relative to your lean body mass, and how low your body fat gets, to where it seems if you want to get really, really lean, you're going to have to be in a status of low energy availability. So once you get to that point, one of the effects on that many-spoked wheel of what happens when you start to take in too little energy for you to maintain your physiological status is you're going to take a hormonal hit. And it's larger, by far, than the amount that you can observe in from just having a low fat intake. So, for example, that Whitaker meta-analysis, when you look at all the various ways of measuring it, whether it's serum testosterone, salivary testosterone, or free testosterone, there's a small standardized mean difference in a reduction. So what that means is, you're looking at a third of a standard deviation down from whatever the mean is. And that's something. But for most men, that's actually not a physiologically relevant reduction in testosterone that you would expect to directly influence lean body mass retention, at least in the short term. If you've got 600 nanograms per deciliters, I've moved countries, I'm forgetting the units that we use in different places. And, if there's a standard deviation of about 200, you're talking a 60, 70, maybe 100 nanogram drop in testosterone just from that fat reduction would be a reasonable thing. And going from 600 to 500 is going to do a whole lot of nothing in most cases, especially in the short term. And by short term, I mean like the length of a diet. However, when you look at case studies on natural bodybuilders, so for example, classic one by Rossau in 2013, there was a 2/3 to 3/4 reduction in the testosterone. Not a third of a standard deviation from the mean difference, but homie started at 1,000 and finished at like 250, 300. And yeah, that probably is not ideal, but guess what? You can do whatever you want with your fat and carbs if you get into stage shape, and if you do the work necessary to get there, there's only so much you can mitigate that. And I think that is why there's this conversation, because it is you have to decide which deal with the devil do you want to make. Do you want to be glycogen depleted and unable to perform well and maybe maintain slightly better testosterone levels to a degree that probably won't have as much of an impact as if you could perform better and maybe be a lower fat intake? Or do you want to try to just maintain a higher step count and, deal with some issues with the constrained energy hypothesis of, there's no good way to escape what happens to you when you have to get into shape. So I think that's a really, really important point. And there is actually some data by Whitaker as well that high protein, low fat diets also result in testosterone and at least cortisol drops from independently from that macronutrient distribution. So
I don't
Go
want
ahead.
to, you're really cooking, but I think you misspoke.
What did I say?
You said high protein, low fat. I think you meant high protein, low carb.
I did. And that's why you're here. And you know why I said that, Trex?
Why?
Because my dietary fat is too low and the myelin sheaths in my neurons that are connecting my brain to my mouth, I'm pretty sure that's where neurons connect, are no longer working.
Man, it's tough.
It's all right.
No,
Who needs it?
Helms. I'm actually going to jump in defense of my friend here, Trex, because you're alluding before. I got to make this tangent. I'm sorry. I have to share a personal story. I've been silent too long. Where you're alluding that natural bodybuilders, their testosterone can dip, right? Prolonged dieting, we all understand this, lower dietary fat intake, yada, yada, yada. And you were saying how Helms is prepping. And yeah, we went into that lab and it did measure that from 13 tests, it was lower your resting metabolism than, what it should be. Okay. But we were talking about this concept that maybe Helms now has currently in an acute sense, lower testosterone. And the story I want to share is that we journeyed 3.5 hours together to go to Arlington, Texas to interview one Mr. Yeah Buddy Ronnie Coleman, 8-time Mr. O. And we're all super excited. But what Helms didn't know is that we all shared a house. This is a true story, Trex. It was what, 6 people? So it was a young blood. So Joseph, Drew, Brandon.
Joseph and Drew.
Yeah. You,
Brandon,
me, Connor.
me,
Yep.
you,
So
and
6.
Connor. Yep, 6.
Yeah. But what Helms didn't know is that the walls were very thin. And so in the morning, Helms took a 30-minute shower. And I'm not going to go into details of what, transpires during a 30-minute shower. But my man's testosterone has been in check, has always been in check, and it's never really an issue, So some people, I guess what I'm trying to share, Helms, some people experience issues and some people just don't because they just got that dog in them. So I know we're speaking generalities, but I wanted to be that person just to big ups my man.
All I was saying is that waterproof phone cases have been a lifesaver for me, or at least a shower improver. And I'll leave it at that. But no, I appreciate both the defense and the correction from both of you. This is why we need this trinity, and I won't say more on that than that. But yeah, I think just for people to understand, you shouldn't have to use these limits most of the time. The only time you would need to skirt the lower end of fat intake is when you're skirting the lower end of an energy intake. The only time you should need to skirt the lower end of an energy intake is when your body requires you to do that to get to a level of leanness that nobody requires you to get to except for a bodybuilding organization. And for almost any other performance, that's not going to be worth it. And then for any other fat loss goal, just take longer, set that as, you can use these as useful minimums to go, all right, well, what's the lowest carb intake I would have before I run into problems? Okay. What's the lowest fat intake I can have before I run into problems? Okay. What's the lowest protein intake I can have before I run into problems? And then you can go, oh, okay, I guess that's how I should constrain my fat loss. But even then, I'd prefer you just take it slower because energy intake is going to be the big one. And after that, training. And if you can preserve those two things, fantastic. And as we've talked about many times, if the diet you use to get to a supposedly sustainable body fat level is so wholly different to what you're normally doing that it teaches you no behavior change and no lessons which you can take into the maintenance phase, you're reducing your likelihood of being able to maintain whatever you've done. So if that's a short-term cut, which absolutely a bodybuilding competition better be, I'm not trying to stay shredded all the time, that's fine. But if it's something you do intend to maintain, or this is part of your overall health journey, you better hope those are behaviors you can maintain.
Yeah, those are great additions. And I do want to reiterate or clarify perhaps, when I talk about making that, just kind of taking it on the chin and saying, yeah, my fat's going lower than it should be to support, sex hormone levels. Like you were saying, only in rare circumstances does that actually make sense. I know I kind of, I didn't want to use the word luxury, but I said it's like negotiable. I think the reason I would frame it that way is because I do come from that bodybuilding world. And if we're being completely honest, if you're bodybuilding, do whatever you want with your fat, it's going to happen, right? Like there's nothing you're going to be able to, I'm sure there are some folks who hit the genetic lottery who can get into stage shape and not experience, meaningful reductions in sex hormone levels. But the vast majority of folks, whether they try to cling to a higher percentage of fat in the diet or not, just by being shredded and exercising a lot, it's likely gonna happen, right? But if you're someone who is dieting for, hey, I'd like to lose 5 or 10 pounds, get back to the weight I was in college, or my blood pressure is a little high, I'd like to get back down a little bit, see if that helps. That's not a trade-off you should be making, right? So that's where, there's just absolutely no reason to say, yeah, maybe I will become, I'll do a diet so extreme that I have a huge drop in estrogen and become amenorrheic to lose 5 or 10 pounds. It just never makes sense outside of these kind of rare situations that I allude to. But when you come up in the bodybuilding world, you get so desensitized to some of this craziness that you're like, yeah, sometimes it makes sense. But for most people, it's such a fringe kind of like edge case. And I know what people are thinking. Eric, give me a break. Real Eric Trexler, give me a break. You call yourself a bodybuilder. I haven't seen you on stage in ages. I had a dream last night that I
No.
last night that
Actually?
I did that I won a professional bodybuilding competition. And it was crazy. I didn't know it was coming up. It was like one of those things where you have an exam you didn't study for and you're like, oh no, I'm unprepared. I didn't prep at all for this competition. I just walked on up and I won. And I actually beat someone who was in better shape than me. And I thought the judges gave it to me for political reasons that I was unaware of. I don't know what I was going to give them in return, but it was a very complicated dream. I was given a bodybuilding title that I didn't deserve, and I felt very weird about it in my dream. But anyway, all of that is to say, once you get
He's
in that
coming
world,
for me. That was a threat, Omar. Did you hear that? He
Yeah.
said, I'm
A
going to
step
walk
on
up.
stage. Yeah.
I'm going to be there. WNBF World, Seattle,
Seattle.
2023, Helms.
I love Seattle. I do.
See? He's like, you know what? Even if you are able to pull off a win, Mr. Conditioned in the light heavies, and I'm going to see you in the overall, walking up, chest hair, not even shape, not color. And just because people like this Eric more than you,
Damn.
WNBF World Champ, get the hell out of here. Go back, try again next year, amateur.
Yeah.
He's coming for me, Omar.
Helms, can I just say this, that I think this is what natural bodybuilding needs, because as we know, no one like follows natural bodybuilding. So it needs this controversy. It needs, okay, so Ronnie had Jay. You want to speak about Ronnie? Ronnie had Jay. Eric needs Eric. Where it's just this rivalry that no one asked for, but now that it's here, because you both have asserted yourself on stage, they have to give it to some sort of winner. Will they give it to Helms? Because of course he put in the work. He clearly is the one that's more shredded, more defined, more proportional. By every conceivable bodybuilding metric, he is the person that should win. Or is it to Trexler because Trexler has the backing of the holy divinity behind him, and then political reasons, syndicates, so on and so forth, corporate cabals, big money, Duke University. I'm not insinuating anything, Trex. I'm just saying that would you, actually, Helms, unrelated question, completely unrelated. Would you say that the person that looks the best on stage, and we would have to define what that means, always unequivocally wins the bodybuilding show? Would you say that always happens in all scenarios?
I have to say no with that
You have to
phrasing.
say no. Okay. Wow. And that was not a leading question. Anyway, sorry, Trex, you were saying what?
Well, no, I was just a little interested that you said that Helms was like, I forget the word you use, like undeniably or obviously more shredded than me, but I'm not sure what evidence that's based on other than assumptions. But like even for someone like for you two, right?
Yeah.
It was 12-1, I think was the way it tallied, or no, 8-1
Yeah.
with the body comp techniques.
Yeah.
So when someone's on trial and the jury's 8-1, there's no consensus, right? Like, I mean,
It's a hung jury.
yeah,
That's right.
jury. It's we don't know who's more shredded between the two of you, and so then the question becomes, am I more shredded than Omar?
Right.
Which is, because if there's no meaningful distinction between the two of you,
Yeah.
and I can compete with him, like let's say he and I go toe to toe and we split it 5-4.
Yeah.
Then we're really cooking. So I kind of reject that premise entirely from a legal basis.
It's a tough one, and I am pretty sure if you look at the WNBF rules that they do actually use the same jurors that they do in legal cases locally. They might also have bodybuilding judges. That might have changed. That might be something that you're aware of, Trex, that I'm not, and it might be scored a little differently than courts. But we can leave that for another episode.
Yeah.
But I think this has been really good. I think just to kind of recap things, we've got, hey, we don't want the gallbladder to create some stones. Have at least like 7 to 12 grams minimum if in the short term. Essential fatty acids are essential for a reason. We like those. Also, fat-soluble vitamins, those are probably pretty good. We like those. Moderate term, shouldn't probably be going below 20 to 30 grams. And then kind of the way you framed it, you called it a luxury, but I would actually say like the difference between malnutrition and optimal health or performance is something that is framed a lot when you look at different fields of nutrition, say sports performance or exercise, physiology versus population health. and in nutritional epidemiology. So, for example, a classic one everyone's probably familiar with, the RDA, based primarily on nitrogen balance and what do we need to do in populations to prevent like kwashiorkor. Very different, because when you double the RDA, you pretty consistently see people with better health outcomes. You see better fall prevention, better outcomes in people who are, elderly, and just general better health markers, and also better outcomes in strength and performance when you're doubling that RDA, going from 0.8 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, right? So I think there's definitely a precedent for that framing that you had. And that is when we were going from, say, 20 to 30 grams to more like 40 to 60 grams, or at least, quote unquote, like 20, 25% of calories from dietary fat. And I think that's a really useful kind of metric, to where you get to essentially select the one that is most appropriate for your scenario. Are you using a nonlinear short-term dieting strategy as a portion of something? Okay, well, how low should I go on that day, a la my colleague Brad Loomis's approach? All right, I am in a bodybuilding contest prep, or I am doing a rapid fat loss phase. I'm aware that that's not ideal for anything sustainable, but I'm cutting down for a photo shoot. I'm a model, or I'm competing in a bodybuilding show. All right, I'm not going to go below 20 to 30 grams. And only when that becomes necessary, because I want to spend the majority of my diet in a place where I'm more likely to sustain muscle mass by sustaining performance primarily, and that's being in an appropriate energy availability level. And in that phase, I'm going to try to keep my fats at least at 40 to 60 grams, and potentially higher if I have the ability to do so and still be on the right time frame. And the most important takeaway that we have from this is that I no longer have to do what I normally do when I get the question of, Eric, you provided a nice minimum carbohydrate intake in your book, and you provided a nice minimum protein intake in your book. What would you say about fat? And my response is typically like, oh yeah, fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, the digestive tract and food enjoyment. Oh, I'm getting a phone call, I gotta go. That's normally how I respond to that question. So now that we have this, I actually feel like I can provide some guidance that is about as evidence-based as can be, and it's not based upon just my feels. So I think that's an important step in my own guruism, which I really appreciate.
Well, I think that's a fantastic summary. The one thing I would kind of add on there is that these are absolute bare minimums if you're doing everything right. Okay.
Yep.
So I don't want you to say, I don't want anyone to walk away from this saying, well, Eric Trexler told me as long as I eat 7 grams of fat per day, I'm good. Right. Even for like that 20 to 30 grams for essential fatty acids, if your fat sources have low percentages of the essential fatty acids, it ain't going to work. Right. And so that's why I've said, like, in this podcast, I've never signed off on a diet personally that averaged less than 30 grams of fat per day across the full week. If you want to throw those really low fat days in the mix, one here and there, whatever, go for it. But I tend to be pretty conservative with fat intake. Helms, that we fought about it before, it got ugly. But so please understand that these are like the theoretical minimums if you're doing everything right. And so for most people, I would say, if you're going below 40 to 60 grams a day, you better have a damn good reason, and you better have either a lot of experience or someone in your corner who has a lot of experience. These trials that are doing 12 grams of fat per day for, a couple months, a few months maybe, they've got a team of physicians and dietitians that are designing these diets, right? So if you don't, that should give you pause.
Yeah, this is not a scenario where it's just, if it fits your macros, don't worry about the minutia. This is a scenario where you actually really do need to worry about the sources of your dietary fats. I think that's a great capstone to this. So no, this has been awesome. In all seriousness, as we've joked about, host, co-host, pyramids, obelisks, who's winning bodybuilding shows when they invite jurors from their local state to also decide whether someone's guilty or not of winning. I really appreciate your time on this, Trex. I appreciate the effort you put into this episode. And anyone who wants a deeper dive, I think actually by the time this episode comes out, because it will be, let's see, do we got one banked right now, Omar?
Alex Colliari Turner. I actually was going to say maybe to move this one on Monday, however, because this is a fire up. It's coming out either this coming Monday, so that would be like August 26th or something, and then or next week.
So worst case, it'll be 4 or 5 days before or 4 or 5 days after our issue of Mass comes out. So if you want to do an even deeper dive into this and read, and you want to get all the references that actually, Kai is going to include a lot of these references. So, but if you want to read this, if you want to do a deeper dive, if you want to track back some of the things that we didn't bring up in this conversation, definitely check out the September 1st issue of Mass, which is either just about to come out or just came out, depending on whether we decide if Dr. Trexler or Dr. Collier-Turner is more exciting. And the jury is out.
Now, it's a fantastic. Let me just echo my co-host Helms having Dr. Eric Trexler on guest host. We don't have to squabble over the details. We're just always honored to have you on, my friend. And I think this was a thoroughly informative episode, all the way from, preventing gallstones to the luxury of actually maintaining your sex hormone levels. I also found, as a quick aside, Helms, Brad Loomis, shout out to 3DMJ, his approach, novel and interesting for himself, where he'll consume 5-2, so 2 days low fat, as a plausible way, interesting to say the least. So go ahead, leave your comments down below. We appreciate everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. We'll do our best to respond to them. You can go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. Typically, people will give 5 stars, or they'll just leave that dang comment. Shout out to Shruti on YouTube, where everyone is too nice. And that is why we're here to take over. We're here for world domination, because, folks, someone's got to do it before they do it. And we'll just put the capital T, they. We're back every single insert date here from now until the end of time. There is a few more words after the end of time, but we'll leave that, and we'll catch you in that next episode. Until next time.